It's now my great pleasure to introduce panel one, which is DIY Print Culture and Citizenship. So reflecting on Norman Rockwell's representation of the ideal of freedom in his interpretation of Roosevelt's Four Freedoms, this panel will delve into a nuanced and contemporary grappling with the less than ideal, when visual satire is often summoned and the depiction of villainy is necessitated. And Rockwell, of course, was not a painter of villains. With DIY Print Culture, the artist citizen introduces such visual political work into the greater culture with a minimum of means, without relying upon a mainstream system of distribution. Cheaply produced pamphlets, affordable prints, and the use of social media platforms. For such artists, the question of audience engagement is crucial. How to responsibly affect a culture of political ideas from a place of independent agency. It's my pleasure now to introduce Ryan Standfest, who's been a great collaborator and coordinator of our event today. He's organized an amazing panel featuring Sue Coe, Robert Sikoryak, and Christopher Sperandio. Ryan is an artist, arts writer, and the editor-in-chief and publisher of Rotland Press, which presents satirical publications of a culturally relevant nature. His publications and prints are in numerous major collections, and his work has been exhibited widely. Ryan has penned criticism and essays for the Detroit Arts and Culture journal Infinite Mile, Detroit Art Review, and Essayed. He contributed a chapter to the book Radical Dreams, Surrealism, Counterculture, and Resistance, forthcoming from Penn State University. Welcome, Ryan. We are so looking forward to this conversation, and welcome to all of our panelists.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. And I also want to thank the Norman Rockwell Museum and the D.B. Dowd Modern Graphic History Library for co-hosting this wonderful event, which I'm honored to take part in. So I am going to, let's see, share this slideshow here. Can everybody see this? Very good. Okay. So by way of an introduction to this panel, I hope to provide a little bit of context as to where I'm coming from and why we have the three panelists that we have to have a conversation today about the topic of our panel. Let's see here. There we are. So in 2010, I started a press, Rotland Press, and initially the only goal of the press was to publish scabrous humor, something that sort of existed in that little space between what was funny and what was not funny. And I can say that this is a very small press, and it makes do with a little bit of resources. It goes very far with a little. And what I mean by that is the press is about printing projects that are produced cheaply, produced quickly, to get into the hands of as many people as possible. But something happened in 2017, and in January in 2017 in particular. I had a lot of friends in social gatherings asking me after the ascendancy of Donald Trump into the presidency, right at the moment of inauguration, what are you going to do? They're practically shaking me by my lapels. Now, as somebody who's not prone to peer pressure, I was nevertheless already thinking, what the hell am I going to do? I'm not somebody who marches, quite frankly, and I'm not somebody who's going to take out a paintbrush and start creating political slogans. I do, however, publish. That's the thing I do. I would always say when somebody would ask me, what are you going to do? I would say, do what you do best when you feel the need to. So I started a publication, a little chapbook quickly put together called American Flytrap. And at the time, I had been researching a publication that was put out in 1932 and 1933 by an editor, a humorist by the name of Alexander King, who was also an all-around raconteur who enjoyed the talk show circuit in the 1950s. And Americana was this extraordinary publication filled with cartoons, and it was political, but it had this irreverence which I had not seen coming from that time in America. And great artists worked for Americana. George Gross created drawings for Americana after he had emigrated to America. William Steig, Al Hirschfield. And it was a no holds barred approach to responding to politics with humor, responding to the threat of fascism and depression, the Great Depression, with humor. So this was a fascinating model for me. In the first issue of American Flytrap, and by the way, I called it Flytrap because it's difficult to find your way out of the flytrap. Two of our panelists today contributed work to that first issue, the post-truth issue. R. Sikoryak, who you can see here, created these two riffs on comic book covers that responded to this notion of post-truth. And Sue Ko. And I was elated when I saw this piece from Sue, because it was delivering precisely the kind of bitter sting that I was hoping for, that would outlast the moment that it was delivered. This could hang around for some time. And in fact, our figure here of Steve Bannon proved himself to be even more grotesque as time went on. And we also see Kellyanne Conway assisting in this process here. Then we moved on to American Flytrap 2. My hope was this would come out very quickly. This would be my attempt at a political periodical, but it started to slow itself down. And all of my best laid plans to have after the gun issue, to have the environment issue, the 1% issue, numerous political issues in which I would sort of break them down into little focal points to sort of make all of this jumble of noise more manageable. It didn't come to pass, and the pandemic came along, and this ended after 2 issues. I have to say there was probably good reason why it ended. I didn't really think about the form as much as I should have, and I don't think it hit the target audience it was intended to. However, as we come to 2020, there was a newfound urgency within me to address the pandemic and a way to find a new model. It wasn't easy for me to start pulling material together and sending it out to a printer. This was during our lockdown. Many places around the country were locked down. So I decided to create a quarterly that would be released online for free. This was the first time I ever attempted that. But I found that the audience growth was incredible, more so than any other fashion of distribution I had tried previously. And with the Plague Review, I received extraordinary responses. I would immediately email artists around the world. There were a total of 85 contributors from 14 different countries. This is a terrific piece by Marcel Zama. This is Peter Jahalski, also known as Labor Camp. And then here we have Sue Ko, who contributed Dr. MAGA, and also did an interview for the issue. And Christopher Sperandio, another of our panelists today, who will spend more time talking about some of the work that you see in these pages. But while I was editing the Plague Review, there was yet another layer of urgency that was coming down upon me. And that was the oncoming election as we approach November. And I had been wanting to work on another project with Sue. And this urgency that was building led to this particular project, American Fascism Now, in which Sue had been working throughout the course of the Trump period on a number of relief prints, tackling the mess, the wreckage that was the Trump administration. So it seemed the right thing to pull a collection of these together very quickly into a small chapbook with a wonderful text by art historian Stephen F. Eisenman that put into context what fascism means in American political culture and American culture at large. And he did a terrific thing of establishing a context for fascism as it has already reared its head throughout our history. I would say that this book, to this day, it is still selling quite strong. It has proven, particularly in 2020, as a publisher of printed objects, print, I am happy to report, is far from dying. It is alive and well, and this book has sold more than any other publication that I have printed throughout my 10 years of running Rotland Press. And it is still, moving out the door as I speak. I'm a little too slow at packaging the items because it's a one-man shipping operation, but it's doing quite well. So this brings me back to Norman Rockwell. One of the things that I find fascinating about participating in this panel, in this symposium, is that I would not think of pairing Rotland Press with the Norman Rockwell Museum or with Norman Rockwell, because Rotland is indeed a bitter pill in printed form. And when I think of Norman Rockwell, and certainly when I look at his Four Freedoms, I've long thought of him as someone who has a moral compass and chooses to ennoble and enlighten through highlighting the more positive aspects of what he sees in domestic American culture. So I often turn to George Gross, who, interestingly enough, was living in America and working while Rockwell was working. And in 1943, while Rockwell had painted the Four Freedoms, Gross, who was a German exile, had fled his country to avoid persecution by the Nazis, found himself in a very muddy place. He was highly misanthropic, lost in many ways in American culture, wanting to embrace the American capitalist dream, but unsure how to. In 1943, while Rockwell had painted the Four Freedoms, Gross had painted a self-portrait, The Wanderer. And as you can see, there are flecks of paint on his smock, an explosion in the background. He is indeed lost. And it's that muddied area that interests me, that collision between hope and despair, of knowing what to do and knowing what not to do. And I can only fantasize what kind of conversation would have occurred between these two artists had they met, had Rockwell left Vermont for New York to meet Gross, or vice versa. And you can see here Gross painting in 1943 in his studio a portrait of Cain, or Hitler in hell. But I imagine that conversation would be fascinating, because indeed it's about a collision of sensibilities. Gross had praised Rockwell. He praised him for his technique and mastery, but he also praised him for his universality, the notion that Rockwell could reach such an audience, and Gross pined for that. But of course, the vision that he was presenting was very different from Rockwell's, but I would argue it was still quite necessary. So in that spirit, this panel is intended to involve a conversation about what our role as makers would be in terms of citizenship. How do we find an audience? How do we address that audience with what we need to address to them? So within print culture, there's a specific conversation that revolves around distribution. These objects that we make, that we print, how do we get them to that audience that we need to get it to? So with that, I will now move over to our first panelist, Sue Ko. I'd like to avoid the standard listing of accomplishments, and instead I will say this about Sue. In my experience, she is a remarkably generous human being. She is ever vigilant and highly devoted and dedicated to the imagery that she produces. And my hope is, certainly with all of the presenters today, that you will get to know them through their own words and their work. And then after that, we'll have a conversation amongst one another. Thank you.
Thank you. Ryan, are you going to? Thank you. Good morning, comrades and others. I did this one right after Biden was elected, and I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. And who has more shoes than a centipede? And I was going to do 100 shoes, but as this is a woodcut, it's too hard. So coup, I got coup right, and I got fascism right. So I'm constantly striving for ways to engage people and get the content over. Next, please, Ryan. And this is just to show you I'm stuck, because I'm in the middle of this one. So I have Miss Freedom, who's on the top of the Capitol, on the top of the Rotunda building, and I have the noose. And the big lie to me is capitalism, and fascism is an expression of capitalism. And I was going to do the fascist mob underneath, attacking freedom. But then I thought, no, I'm more concerned with the engine driver, not the oil rags. So who funds fascism in America? And that's extremely complicated to find because of the slush funds of super PACs. So you've got a cat and mouse kind of game going on with corporations now where they're disowning their support of the fascist, former fascist, meanwhile still pushing money towards, I mean, let's say it's, I can't even think of this. It's an economic legalization of political corruption. So that's the big lie, that what can we do? How can we resist this, in my case, in art? Next, please. I did this before Trump was elected. It can happen here, and I have read the book, where I knew he's a career racist, an absolutely despicable scumbag. As a New Yorker, I'm saying this with past experience. And this took me about 40 minutes, and it just went everywhere, and I was pleased, but it's not good art. And this is where my concern is making what I consider to be good art, that is layers of interest containing the truth. And propaganda doesn't always do that, and there's nothing wrong with the word propaganda. It just means to propagate ideas from the Roman Catholic Church, 15th century, that offices of propaganda. Next, please. And this I didn't do for the Women's March, but it went around with the Women's March. It was published many, many, many times. That not only is he a career racist, he's an abuser of women. And it's absolutely shocking that 50% of white women voted to have their human rights taken away. So, you know, unless the Democratic Party can find a way to govern, these conditions will keep coming back, keep hitting us again and again. Next, please. This one, a friend who's, you know, I always work as a team of people, and a friend who's a lawyer said we live in an asylum. And the contradiction to me is the more deaths there are, the higher the Dow goes. So, you know, this is the contradiction of capitalism, that it is not indicative of health that the Dow makes more profit for the 1% than how can one even absorb this information? So I had him as Renfield, like eating flies hanging off the ceiling. And I feel that we are in this insane asylum where we cannot even question the mental colonialization of capital. There's nothing in the Constitution that demands that we have to believe in capitalism. Next, please. This was when he showed up with the Bible. He didn't have it upside down. He had it back to front, actually. But this is the type of force used against Black Lives Matter demonstrators who are absolutely, in this instance and most other instances, completely peaceful, organized, and disciplined, fighting for human rights, as Rockwell would have approved, beaten, gassed, military, you know the story. But again, this isn't good art particularly, but I got something captured there about it. Next, please. He incites fascist violence. This one is, out of all of them, the most I'm pleased with, because it's an alliteration on coronavirus. carnivorous, and the extent of viruses coming from our imposition into other non-human persons' world is astonishing. So in terms of factory farming, which are incubators for viruses, is capitalism worth this? That the meat industrial complex makes a fortune. Is this worth it to the world? Is this worth it to all the species that are being destroyed? 1 trillion sea creatures being murdered every year. Billions of land animals, wild animals being destroyed for profit. This is acceptable? No, it's not. So this has been the bulk of my work. And now, next, please. This is when he accused people of being anti-fascist. And I always assumed America was supposed to be anti-fascist. And can you imagine the irony of being accused of being an anti-fascist? So again, back to the, I want to say, political depravity of this statement is so astonishing. Next, please. This is Mitch McConnell can't find a racist bone, and for art history purposes, this is John Hartfield, and throwing gasoline on the flame. You know, I remember the days when, of the Obama birth certificate. Where is Obama's birth certificate? And this is how this evil creature rose to prominence, by hunting down Obama's birth certificate. And it will be interesting to see, you know, how the Republicans vote to impeach or not. I mean, it's not that interesting because we know the majority of them will not. Next, please. This, I was thinking in a very, it's funny sort of, scientists discover a vaccine against fascism. And I missed out on Jim Jordan, who's very triggering. We've all got remotes around to cancel out his voice. So I've got Ted Cruz. And who funds Ted Cruz? I'll ask you, because it's interesting. It's someone called Thiel, who came from BlackRock, who's since had different corporation name changes. But who's funding that? And I think that's journalism to me, because we can say, well, Home Depot, okay, or we could say Taco Bell, which fund Trump, but it's not the whole board, it's just people within the board. So 20% of the money could be going to super PACs. Next, please. This is the last one I'm showing, hope. I don't have any hope, personally. I think it's very liberating not to have hope. Then you can go on to fight them. So hope is a thing with feathers that flies away, but this is Stacey Abrams. So I imagine to Stacey Abrams, what she's done to honor America is phenomenal. So yes, there's hope in that sense. I think that's all. Thank you, Ryan.
Okay, so our next panelist that we're going to hear from is R. Sikoryak. And once again, rather than listing a number of achievements, I will say this about Bob's work, is that I feel that it achieves something very rare, in that its intelligence and wit and conceptual rigor sort of sneak up on you. You're entertained and seduced first in the way he mines our canon of comics language. And then there's another level that you find yourself entering into. So with that, if you'd like to take it over.
Yeah, so yes, thank you so much, Ryan. That was very nice introduction. I'm really honored to be on this panel with you all. I'm just going to give a little background about myself. I usually play with parodies, pastiches of American comics, sometimes international comics, and I usually pair them with historical or literary sources. So I thought this would be an appropriate place to start. And often my work will adapt literary classics like Crime and Punishment or Wuthering Heights. Recently, I adapted the iTunes Terms and Conditions into a graphic novel, which is a long story. We won't get into that today. But after the 2016 election, I really felt like I wanted to say something about what was happening. So rather than go with a big publisher, I actually put out a mini comic called The Unquotable Trump, where I took quotes from the president-elect and inserted them into parodies of existing American comic book covers. So all of the language here is things that Trump said, and they're all based on specific, you'll see he's like kind of battling with specific characters you might recognize from comics. So I made this kind of as a protest, just to sort of say, I object. I don't need to say why I don't like Trump right now, but I put this out just to sort of get it out of my system, and my publisher asked me if I would expand it into a color book, which I was very happy to do. But these are some of the pages from it. So I tried to cover kind of all of his aspects, all of the multitudes of terribleness he includes, but also really keep reflecting back to American comics, which is where I live and where, what's important to me. So these are just a few pages just to give you a sense of the book. So that came out in 2017, and I really wanted to do something else that spoke to the moment, but I didn't want to draw Trump anymore, and I felt like I'd said everything that I needed to say. So I went to the Constitution, another literary classic that not everybody reads, including myself. I mean, I don't feel like I am a constitutional scholar by any means, but I knew this was a good piece of material to work with. Every pundit says you have to read the Constitution. So I did, and I made this book, which, like my previous work, takes the history of, in this case, solely American comics, and use it to illustrate the Constitution. So I'm just going to show you a bit of my layout here. These are 10 pages in progress. I'm just breaking down the text into small, understandable chunks, and then illustrating what might happen. I made a chart of characters from American comics and cartoons and animated shows that I wanted to include. The idea here was to really express the multitude of American comics as a substitute for the American people, or as a stand-in for the American people. So I tried to represent age, race, and gender of creators and characters, and slowly built the book up. Each page is in a different style. So I'm just going to flip through a few of the pages here just to give you a sense. The first page on the left is a parody of Raina Telgemeier, who is one of the most successful and great cartoonists who does young adult comics. I always get middle grade comics. I always get the terminology wrong, but she has a huge fan base. And then I wanted to make sure that throughout, people who maybe would recognize these characters from television shows or bumper stickers, or their alternative newspapers, would see something in here that they might recognize, or maybe just the comics themselves, the original comics. And I really worked hard to make it all-inclusive and to really suggest that the Constitution is for everyone. And also, I really wanted to play with the idea of interpreting the Constitution. While the text is the complete original text, I tried to keep all the typos and punctuation as it was, but I wanted to make sure that while the text was sacrosanct, the images could sort of talk back to it or argue with it in one way or the other. And again, here's a good example of representing race and gender in the comics. This is the Boondocks on the left and Brenda Starr on the right. And this is maybe my favorite spread of the book. This is, on the left, we have The Yellow Kid, which was one of the most popular comics in 1898. And then on the right, we have Dog Man, which is a super popular graphic novel series that is happening right now. So whether you are 140 or 5, hopefully you will see some character in here that you'll recognize. And there's an index in the back in case you missed any of the references. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Moving along here, and once again, if any of you out in the audience have questions, please forward them, and we're going to reserve a Q&A session after our last presentation, which will be by Christopher Sperandio. And again, one of the things I find fascinating about Chris's work is his ability to mine this other moment in American culture from the past, when there's this notion that comics were indicative of some sort of innocence, but Chris finds these, pulls them out, reworks them, only to show us that there was really no such thing as innocence in American culture. It was all an illusion, and it continues to be. So with that, Chris, if you'd like to talk a little bit about your work.
Yeah, great. Thanks everybody for having me. I feel a little bit like a dog in the manger. So just, I'm going to bark for 5 quick minutes, and then we'll let it go after that. So here's my contact information. If you want to send me hate mail or death threats, the best way is sperandio@rice.edu, where I'm a professor at Rice, or you can find me on Instagram. If anybody knows who I am today, it's through this work, which was a work that I made fresh out of college. So I'm kind of a one-hit wonder in that respect, that I made this collaborative project with a chocolate makers union in Chicago. And based on that work, I've been working ever since. That work really sort of made me notorious. Here's my collaboration with DC Comics and the Museum of Modern Art that I produced in 2002. Like I said, I teach at Rice University, and I've managed to establish the Comic Art Teaching and Study Workshop, which is a kind of hub of comics production and also research. And I'm quite proud of the things that I've been able to do with the organization. This is a installation shot of an exhibition in Houston in 2018. It went to Chicago in 2019, an exhibition about Mexican comic art from the 1960s and 1970s. I also was happy enough to produce a film. This is a film about Jack Jackson that was shot as he worked on his final graphic history. And this film was premiered at Angoulême Festival in France last year, right before the pandemic. And then also through CATS, I produced this monograph on a Mexican comic artist, Julio Camarena, who is a really terrific comic artist and completely forgotten now. And I'm lucky enough to have a lot of his work at CATS. I'm also an artist producing comics now. And this is Pinko Joe, my first sort of graphic novel. And it premiered last year, 2 weeks before the pandemic started. So I've got all sorts of good luck, but Pinko Joe is basically a kind of looking at 1950s propaganda comics. And in the comics in the 1950s, all the villains wore suits. And I thought, that it's like today, all the villains wear suits today. And so in Pinko Joe, all the villains are bankers and lawyers. After the pandemic started and I'm trapped at home, I began making a kind of daily drawings and posting them on Instagram, because it was either that or my neighbors would notice a bad smell coming from my apartment after not seeing me for a couple of weeks. So you can visit my Instagram. There are hundreds of these at this point, and they're all a kind of expression of angst and frustration at mainly at the Trump administration the hypocrisy and the lunacy that we witness through our screens on a daily basis. It's ridiculous. It's like something out of a science fiction movie. And I really enjoy that quote that Ryan, I'm going to quote Ryan, do what you do good. Basically what I do good is I get mad good, and I say snarky things good. And so that's what the drawings that I've been producing for Instagram are basically, these sort of one panel expressions. And you'll have to forgive my bad language here, but it really is obscene that the rich are getting richer while the rest of us are dying by the hundreds of thousands. And I think I have one more slide. This is all on automatic, so I didn't have to think about it. But I'm pretty proud of some of these. I really churn these out quickly. I don't know that they're art. I don't care if anybody else likes them, but I really do want you to follow me on Instagram, which is at Pinko Joe with a little underscore. And that's me.
With that, we'll segue you into the Q&A session. I wish I had a little bit of whiskey over here. This is the one thing that's problematic about this this Zoom thing. We can't meet at a bar in a hotel lobby afterwards, which I always find helps after presentations. But I think what I'm going to do, I had a few questions drawn up, and I'm going to forward some audience questions that were coming in while we were talking. So let's see, the first question that I have here, which was in reference to Sue's presentation: good art versus getting a point across in a timely way when inspiration strikes. How does Sue balance this challenge within the scope of her practice? And I would extend that to all of the panelists.
I think I started to do woodcut and lino cut, which is very old school, because of digital media, because they could get it out faster, which is ironic. So the paintings and drawings weren't reading on digital media, but the woodcuts were. And I think it's, and we're trained, I've worked for magazines and newspapers since I was 16, 15. So this is all about fast response time with forensic research, which really is a problem to me, the forensic research part. And what digital media has shown me is how fast something's working. So I could work for 3 years on a book and not know if the content's going to work. And it comes out and it doesn't sell 5 copies. But with digital media, I can see how the work's being picked up, which isn't necessarily, doesn't make it good art or meaningful art. And so I think we're still exploring those aspects of quick reaction, forensic research, which is, as an artist, you have to drop it. You have to let go of research. Once you've absorbed it, you let it go to make art. So it's, other people, please, that's it.
Chris, you had mentioned something about possibly not making good art.
Well, that's easy. I can do that all day. Yeah, I've got a great job. I work for a very wealthy university, and so I don't have to make anybody else happy. It's wonderful to not have to give a shit about what people think. Academic freedom is a wonderful thing. And so is it good art? Is it bad art? I don't know. And I don't think I get to decide that, really, right? I think other people decide. And with Instagram, you can track you can really track like, oh, people really like this one or nobody liked that one. And people always like the ones that I don't like very much. So I don't know if people are a good judge of what's good or what's not good.
Bob, do you ever run into that debate?
Good versus bad? Good versus...
Should I move forward with this? Should I not? Does this need to be with a capital A art?
Oh, well, I would avoid the word art if I could, just because that's, I think I agree. I think that's for others to decide. I certainly have really high standards for myself, but one thing that I've started to do in the last few years is to put out more zines, more black and white photocopied comics, to make work faster and just put it out. I used to put all my work on Tumblr, which was really exciting for me because I'd never had like immediate responses like that before. But I come from a tradition of working for magazines and really trying to make the work perfect. And I certainly have a lot of perfection in me. But when you're speaking to the moment, sometimes it gives you the liberty to not second guess yourself too much and to put it out there. Luckily, even though Instagram is forever, no one notices after a while. Something new will come up. You know, it's a great quote from Charles Schultz about doing a daily strip. He's like, if you have a bad idea, it doesn't matter. Tomorrow you're going to have another one. So if you can keep that in mind, it liberates you a bit.
Well, that certainly gets to the idea of, I mean, some of you have already mentioned this a little bit, audience. You know, do you have any sense of who your audience is? Does it matter to you to identify an audience, or are you just seeing what happens, you know, casting the net and seeing what happens? And I guess that what I'm going to sort of put in parentheses, another part to that question, which is this idea of mainstream and not the mainstream. Is it possible to make critical audience within a mainstream framework? Or does that level of criticality have to happen outside of a mainstream framework? Are you looking for a mainstream audience? Do you care? Or are you seeing what you can get?
No, I don't care about a mainstream audience. And if back to printmaking, I can make prints cheap, very cheap, and I can get them out fast, and we can save lives. So that sounds a bit pretentious, but it's true. So someone can afford a $20 print that's never purchased art before, and they've decided this is art, and that money can be used immediately to save a life. So that's what I've learned with printmaking is, well, you do bad art, you're not keen on it, but someone else can afford a $20 print and they can fundraise off that, and we can save a life today. We can save a life immediately. And art doesn't happen until the viewer makes it happen. So what I think of as good or bad is within myself as a professional, whatever we want to call it, artist. So that's the joy of printmaking. It's got this immediacy, urgency. We own the means of production. I've got a wonderful anti-fascist gallery. You know, they escaped Nazi Germany, so they should know fascism when they see it. And they help that process. So
what's the gallery, Sue?
Gallery Saint Etienne. It means Saint Steve because they escaped to Paris. Then they were chased out of Paris. They fled Paris and came to America. And so the artists they took with them, they cherished that art. They took the art with them. And they're an amazing bunch of people with, you know, German expressionism. They took that Austrian expressionism. So I've been around that art since I've been with them. It's been a great honor to have that history.
I would interject to, you know, when I was a student in graduate school studying printmaking, it's a confusing experience because there was always this need to make art with a capital A and sell it for lots of money, which seemed to defy the logic of what printmaking is about. So you were a constant model of, no, you can go back to what it should be, and you can sell it for less to reach more. So what's that?
Cheap multiples.
Yes, cheap multiples, and I still, that voice is constantly in my head, and I thank you for being part of the group of artists that stuck with that. So,
Thank you.
Chris, Bob, any thoughts on that question where we were about audience and mainstream versus not mainstream, above ground versus, I don't know if there's an underground anymore, but independent.
I've always tried to make my work accessible in that I always try to use sources that people will recognize. But then what I combine them with is totally up to me, and it's just my own obsessions. So the terms and conditions book I did, I didn't expect anyone to want that, but I made it for myself as an experiment, and people really responded to it, and they read a lot into it. They kind of like what I think Sue said earlier about people making it art. It's like people's response to it were more varied than my initial idea, and you don't know that until the audience sees it. But my relationship to the audience varies from project to project.
Let me ask a question. Sue, you carve these things by hand?
Yes, I've got the little tools. You know, if you do wood carving, the most important part of this is sharpening, because I learned how to do this myself, but it's sharpening. And it's part of our trauma, is gouging into lino, you know, because America's going through a trauma right now. It's not related to your question. And it's an emotional trauma memory. And I'm worried when America has trauma, bad things happen, worse things. Remember 911. But the process of making this work is really organizing my own. Oh, this is so traumatizing. You gouge in, you're surrounded by chips of wood flying everywhere and lino, and it's messy, but it's sharpening. That's what I'd say. You've got to keep your tools sharpened. Otherwise you cut yourself.
That must be really hard on your hands though.
But it's hard on your hands if you have to wiggle the tool because you're not keeping it sharp. If it's razor sharp, like I've cut myself and I don't even know because it's so sharp. So hopefully as cultural workers, we can stay sharp. That's it.
All right, Ryan, sorry for that. I just, I studied printmaking and I know how hard that can be on you physically, to do that physically.
It does involve blood sometimes. Much blood over the years myself, and witnessed many students handling the tool incorrectly, despite what one tells them not to do. But do we want to take a few more questions from the audience, or let's see. Or Chris, did you have any thoughts about, I'm still going to steer you back, mainstream, not mainstream? Do you care? Is it all the same?
Netflix is welcome to contact me about adopting COVID capitalism, eat shit losers into a series or a movie.
No, Pinko Joe, man, that's your next, big budget film.
With any luck, the Koch brothers will buy it and just flip the meaning around, invert the meaning like they like to do.
Yes.
Work makes freedom kind of nastiness.
Right.
I skirted with a little bit of notoriety. I don't need it. Screw them.
Yeah. There's freedom when somebody's not watching over you. So, yeah.
Oh, they're watching.
well, I mean,
not to go all QAnon on you, but
I just always assume somebody's watching me. Yes, I just live with that, and there's always guilt. Nevertheless, that's another conversation. But we're close to our finishing time here, and I guess we could, we should wrap this up and allow the next panel to start. But I want to thank everybody for participating in this. It's been an honor for me to chair a panel with the three of you. whose work I've long admired, continue to admire, and I look forward to what you're going to work on next. So I thank you for joining this conversation today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Nice to meet you all.